We are awash in data. Like, it's everywhere. And the true hurdle, I think, isn't just collecting it, but like really figuring out what it means, without spending ages painstakingly labeling everything.
It's about extracting that essential knowledge, right? Finding the signal buried in all that noise.
Exactly. And that's what we are diving into today. It's like a quest for AI alchemy or something.
I like that analogy.
So if you're like me and you're all about maximizing knowledge, like really getting to the heart of things quickly and effectively, then today is definitely for you. Because we're going deep, like deep, deep into a method that's all about finding those academically rock solid representations of data.
We're going to dissect a truly innovative approach.
You got it. We're talking about neural discrete representation learning with a special focus on this thing called the Vector Quantised-Variational AutoEncoder, VQ-VAE for short.
It's a pretty big deal in the world of AI, and it all started with a groundbreaking paper presented at NIPS back in 2017.
And thankfully, we have your amazing All Notes 225411 to guide us through the nitty-gritty. These notes, by the way, are a lifesaver. They break down the complexities of that original neural discrete representation learning paper in such a clear, concise way, which is super helpful for us.
Glad they're useful.
So our mission today is pretty clear, I think. We're not just going to skim the surface of VQ-VAE. We're going to really unpack it, like understand what makes it tick, what makes it academically significant, what makes it so groundbreaking and innovative in the world of machine learning.
Exactly. We're after the why behind the what.
Exactly. So to kick things off, maybe you could set the stage a bit. What was the fundamental challenge in unsupervised learning that this whole VQ-VAE thing was trying to tackle?
Right. So the core problem, as you hinted at, is this. How do you learn useful representations from data that isn't labeled? It's a bit like trying to understand a foreign language without a dictionary or a translator. It's a foundational problem in machine learning. Now, variational autoencoders, or VAEs, were a big step in the right direction, but they had their limitations, especially when you had powerful decoders. You would often run into something called posterior collapse.
Posterior collapse. Yeah, that sounds pretty ominous, like a black hole or something. What exactly is that? And how did the VQ-VAE folks, try to get around it?
Okay, so imagine this. You've got a VAE, right, and you've paired it with one of these super powerful autoregressive decoders. These decoders, they're really good at modeling complex data. Like they can reconstruct an image pixel by pixel.
Okay, so they're pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, they are. But the problem is sometimes they get so good at their job that they kind of bypass the whole point of the encoder. The decoder ends up reconstructing the input almost perfectly, but it's doing it all on its own. It's basically ignoring the latent variables that the encoder is supposed to be, learning. So the encoder, the part that's supposed to be figuring out the meaningful representations, becomes useless. It collapses, hence the term posterior collapse.
So it's like the decoder is going rogue?
You could say that. Now, to combat this, the VQ-VAE team took a radical approach. They shifted from the traditional continuous latent variables to something called discrete latent codes.
Discrete codes. Okay, so that's a big departure. It's like swapping out, I don't know, a smooth, continuous spectrum for a set of distinct, separate blocks. What was the thinking behind that?
The idea actually came from signal processing. There's this technique called vector quantization, which essentially boils down to representing a huge set of vectors with a smaller, more manageable set of prototypes. We call them code words. Think of it like a dictionary for vectors.
Okay, I see. So it's like creating a more efficient, compressed way to represent the information.
Exactly. Now, in the VQ-VAE, you have three main parts. You have the encoder, the discrete latent space, which is represented by this embedding table, a table of vectors, essentially, and then you have the decoder. So what happens is the encoder takes the input, like an image, for example, and maps it to a continuous output. But instead of using this directly, like in a traditional VAE, the VQ-VAE then looks at this embedding table, this dictionary of vectors, and finds the vector that's closest to the encoder's output.
Okay, so it's like a matching game.
Yeah, you could say that. It's finding the best fit. And the index of that closest vector, that becomes our discrete latent variable.
So it's essentially forcing the representation to choose from one of these predefined categories, kind of like a multiple choice question, right?
That's a good way to put it. And the way this closest vector is found is through a mathematical calculation. We use squared Euclidean distance. So if you imagine each vector as a point in space, we're basically measuring the distance between those points and picking the word that's closest.
Okay, I think I'm following. So the encoder finds the best match from the code book. and that becomes the discrete code. Then what happens? How does the decoder use this code to reconstruct the original image?
Right. So the decoder takes that closest embedding vector, the one that was picked, and uses it as its input. And from this, it tries to reconstruct the original image. Now, what's really groundbreaking here, theoretically speaking, is that we've introduced this discrete bottleneck into the whole VAE framework. This was a huge shift from the standard practice of using continuous latent spaces.
Right, right. So we've got this discrete code book and this whole idea of forcing the encoder to choose from a limited set of options. That's one big innovation. But you also mentioned something about a learned prior. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's the second key difference from standard VAEs. So in a normal VAE, the prior distribution over the latent variables, it's usually something fixed, something like a Gaussian distribution. But in the VQ-VAE, this prior distribution is learned from the data.
So instead of assuming a prior, it actually figures it out based on the data it's seeing.
Exactly. Now, initially, during the training process, this prior is uniform, meaning every single discrete code, every vector in the codebook is equally likely. But then, after the VQ-VAE has been trained, a second model comes into play, usually something like a pixel CNN if we're dealing with images, or a wavenet for audio. These are models that are really good at modeling sequences and dependencies.
Okay, so they come in after the VQ-VAE has done its thing.
Right. And they're trained on the sequence of discrete codes that the VQ-VAE has learned. What this does is it allows this second model to figure out the underlying structure, the dependencies within the latent space. So it's essentially learning which sequences of discrete codes are more likely to appear together. And this learned prior then reflects the true distribution of these codes in the data.
So it's like a two-step process. The VQ-VAE discovers the basic building blocks, the discrete codes, and then this second model figures out how to put those blocks together in a meaningful way.
Precisely. And this shift from a static, predefined prior to a dynamically learned prior, one that adapts to the structure of the data, that's a big part of what makes VQ-VAE so innovative.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. Now let's go back to posterior collapse for a second. How do these two innovations, the discrete latent codes and the learned prior, how do they actually help prevent the decoder from taking over and ignoring the encoder?
Okay, so this is where it gets really clever. Remember how we said that posterior collapse happens when the decoder gets too powerful and bypasses the latent representation? Well, the VQ-VAE addresses this head-on with this discrete bottleneck created by the vector quantization process.
Okay, so how does that work?
By forcing the encoder's output to be mapped to a discrete code, one of those predefined categories from the codebook, the model ensures that the latent space is actually used for reconstruction. The decoder can't just ignore it.
Oh, I see. Because it needs that specific discrete code to find the corresponding vector in the codebook to actually reconstruct the input.
Exactly. It's like a key and lock system that the decoder needs the key, the discrete code, to unlock the information stored in the embedding vector. This is a huge breakthrough because it allows us to train latent variable models with really expressive decoders, something that was always a big challenge with traditional VAEs.
That's pretty amazing. But I have to ask, how do you actually train a model that has this discrete component? It seems like that would create some problems, mathematically speaking.
Yeah, you're right. The quantization step, the part where we find the nearest neighbor in the codebook, it's not differentiable, which means traditional gradient descent, the workhorse of deep learning, it can't really work directly.
Right, because you need those gradients to tell the model how to adjust its weights.
Exactly. So the VQ-VAE uses a very clever trick. It employs a special loss function with three parts, and one of those parts is designed specifically to address this differentiability issue.
Okay, so let's break down this special loss function. What are the three parts?
All right, so the first part is something you see in all autoencoders. It's the reconstruction loss. It basically measures the difference between the original input, the image, let's say, and the output of the decoder after it has been fed the quantized latent representation.
So it's trying to make sure the reconstructed image is as close to the original as possible.
Right, and this loss optimizes both the decoder and indirectly the encoder. Now, to get around the non-differentiability of that nearest neighbor lookup, the VQ-VAE uses something called the straight-through gradient estimator.
Okay, that sounds complicated. What's that?
Well, it's a bit technical, but essentially what it does is, during backpropagation, when the model is figuring out how to adjust its weights, it treats that quantization step as if it were an identity function.
So it kind of pretends that discrete step isn't really happening?
Yeah, you could say that. It allows the gradients to flow directly from the decoder's input back to the encoder's output. So the model can learn even though there's this non-differentiable operation in the middle.
That's pretty ingenious. All right, so we've got the reconstruction loss. What's the second part?
The second part is called the VQ loss, sometimes also called the codebook loss. This one calculates the L2 norm, which is just a fancy way of saying the squared Euclidean distance between the encoder's output and the embedding vector that was chosen from the codebook.
So it's looking at how far apart those two vectors are.
Exactly. And the purpose of this loss is to pull those embedding vectors closer to the encoder outputs it's seeing during training. This is how the codebook itself learns and adapts to the data.
Okay, so it's like the code book is constantly refining itself based on the encoder's output.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Now, the third and final part is the commitment loss.
Okay, what does this one do?
So this one also calculates the L2 norm between the encoder's output and the chosen embedding vector. But this time, it uses a trick called stop gradient on the embedding vector.
Stop gradient. What does that mean?
It basically means that the embedding vector is treated as a constant during backpropagation. This prevents it from changing too rapidly in response to every single encoder output, and it encourages the encoder to commit to a particular embedding, to stick with its choice.
Okay, so it's like a stabilizing force.
Yeah, you could say that. It prevents things from getting too chaotic. And the overall loss function, it's typically a combination of all three of these: the reconstruction loss, the VQ loss, and the commitment loss.
So it's a carefully balanced recipe that allows the model to learn these discrete representations effectively. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like a whole new way of training a neural network.
It really is. And what's even more remarkable is that the resulting latent space, it doesn't just capture a compressed version of the input, it actually learns to represent those high-level, semantically meaningful features that we were talking about.
The objects and images, the phonemes in speech.
Exactly, the things that really matter. And it does this in a discrete, categorical way.
So it's not just reducing the dimensionality of the data, it's finding the essence, the underlying building blocks.
That's right. And because of the way it's trained, the VQ-VAE is much less likely to get distracted by noise or irrelevant details. It focuses on the big picture, the high-level concepts.
Right, right. And then we bring in the autoregressive model to learn the relationships between those high-level concepts.
Exactly. The VQ-VAE gives us the alphabet, and the autoregressive model learns the grammar.
That's a fantastic analogy. So what about the results? What kind of evidence did the authors present to show that this whole VQ-VAE thing actually works?
Oh, the results were pretty impressive. For example, on the CIFAR 10 image dataset, which is a standard benchmark, the VQ-VAE achieved a log likelihood performance that was very close to the state-of-the-art continuous VAEs at the time.
So it was competitive with the best models out there.
Yeah, which was a big deal because it showed that a discrete latent variable model could actually perform just as well as its continuous counterparts. That was a huge challenge to the prevailing wisdom at the time.
And what about more complex data sets?
They also tested it on ImageNet, which is a much larger and more challenging dataset. And again, the results were amazing. They were able to generate high-quality images using a combination of the VQ-VAE and a pixel CNN prior.
So it wasn't just good at representing the data, it could actually generate new data that looked realistic.
Exactly, and they showed similar results on frames from the DeepMind lab environment. And what was even more impressive is that they were able to avoid posterior collapse even when they used a very compressed representation with just 3 latents for the entire image.
Wow, so it's very robust.
Yeah, it was. And they didn't just stick to images. They also explored audio and even unsupervised linguistic discovery.
Linguistic discovery, what do you mean?
So they trained the VQ-VAE on speech data, and they found that it learned a latent space that captured the high-level linguistic content of the speech, like the words and phonemes, while ignoring the speaker-specific details. And then by training a wavenet on those discrete latents, they were able to generate new speech samples that were actually meaningful.
So they were able to, like, generate new sentences.
Yeah, basically. And they also showed that they could convert the speech from one speaker to another, which suggests that the model had learned to separate the content of the speech from the identity of the speaker.
That's really cool. But what about the linguistic discovery part?
Right. So to see how well the model was learning linguistic units, they tried to map the discrete codes it had learned to actual phoneme sequences. And they did this without giving the model any information about the phonemes during training. It was completely unsupervised.
Okay, so they were basically testing whether the model had figured out the building blocks of language on its own.
Exactly. And the results were amazing. They achieved a mapping accuracy that was way better than chance. It showed that the VQ-VAE was actually learning linguistically relevant features without any explicit supervision.
That's incredible. And they also did some experiments with video, right?
Yes, they used the DeepMind Lab environment again, and they were able to generate video sequences that were conditioned on actions. So they could tell the model to generate a video of an agent performing a certain task, and it would actually do it. And the quality of the videos was very good.
So the VQ-VAE was able to learn temporal dependencies, not just spatial dependencies.
Right. And it was able to do this directly in the latent space, which is much more efficient than working in the pixel space.
That's pretty remarkable. So overall, the VQ-VAE seemed to perform really well on a variety of tasks.
It did, and the authors concluded that it represented a major step forward in unsupervised representation learning, especially when it came to discrete latent variables.
So just to recap, the key innovations here are the use of discrete latent codes, the learn it prior, and the ability to avoid posterior collapse.
Exactly. And all of this was backed up by some very impressive experimental results across a range of different data modalities.
Right. And what's really fascinating for me is that this model is able to uncover these fundamental building blocks of complex data without any labels, without any hand-holding. It's like it's discovering the hidden structure of the world on its own.
It's a powerful idea, and it makes you wonder what other kinds of hidden structures might be out there just waiting to be discovered by similar techniques.
Exactly. Like if it can figure out the building blocks of language just by listening to speech, what else could it do? What other seemingly continuous data might actually be composed of discrete units that we haven't even thought of yet?
It's a very intriguing question, and it could have implications far beyond traditional AI.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly insightful dive into the VQ-VAE. I feel like I've learned a lot.
You too.
And for anyone listening who's really interested in digging deeper, I highly recommend checking out the original NIPS paper. There's so much more to explore.
It's a great starting point for a journey into the world of unsupervised learning.
Thanks again for joining us today. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring.